Hello. How does your back feel in your back bends? I had quite a few questions about back pain, particularly in the low back, while doing back bends. And so in this video, I want to talk about the difference between hip extension and spinal extension, as opposed to hip flexion, spinal flexion. Okay, so let's just go through that again. Spinal extension is when your spine moves in this direction. Okay, I can do cervical spine extension just with my neck by looking up. Hip extension is done through the gluteus maximus, the big, huge muscle right at the back. Okay, that acts as a hip extensor to extend through the hip. Hip flexion, spinal flexion. Hip extension and spinal extension. But very often what happens, maybe it's through weak glutes, maybe it's because somebody's telling you to relax your glutes in a back bend, which by the way, if anybody tells you that, just ignore them. Or possibly because just of the tilt of your pelvis. So ideally we want the pelvis to remain neutral or even go into a posterior tilt. So can you imagine that as I tilt my pelvis forward, then that's creating more extension in my low back, but my hips go into flexion. We want to have extension through the hips. We create more length then through the low back. Then we keep that as we go into our back bends, so that yes, we're going into spinal extension through the low back, the mid back and upper back if we're going perhaps towards like something like camel. But what happens very often, and this is often because of our lifestyle of spending so many hours sitting down where we're in hip flexion. So this creates tightness as well as weakness in the muscles here in the hip flexors, and the glutes also get very weak and lazy. And so if we're not properly using our glutes to extend our hips, then when we go into a back bend, the hips kind of stay where they are and all of the extension comes from the low back, and that is what can cause a lot of pain because then we get this compression in the low back from it doing all of the bending. So what you need to pay attention to is not just what your back is doing, but what your hips are doing. And in fact, this is a problem that I have had to work on a lot myself, because for me, it's very comfortable to just kind of be like this all the time. And so my hip flexors are very, very tight. But to go into every back bend thinking about tilting the pelvis back, using the gluteus maximus, trying to open up through the hip flexors as much as possible, and then keeping my low back as long as possible through the use of the glutes, but not just squeezing the glutes like crazy, but squeezing them in a way that you get that tilt backwards of the pelvis to help open up through the front here. Okay, so the way that I often think about this is like sexy butt, where you're sticking your butt out. It looks real sexy. This is the anterior tilt of the pelvis, okay? Unfortunately, sexy butt is not what we want. We want ugly butt. See how ugly that is? But that creates this posterior tilt of the pelvis where the hip flexors are more elongated. Bring the ugly butt shape into your back bends. Now remember, a back bend is not just something like a camel pose or a wheel pose. We also have a back bending kind of posture when we're in a low lunge, for example. And so I want to still think about my pelvis not tilting forward, not doing sexy butt, but tilting it back, using my glutes, ugly butt, and that's going to help open up through not just the hip flexors, but also we can get into the quads a little bit as well. And your quads, the big muscles at the front, are technically hip flexors too. Some of them work in that way as well. And this can help with a lot of knee pain that occurs as well. Because if the quads are tight and they're not wanting to stretch out too much, then going into a lot of flexion of the knee can create this pulling in the knee as well. So think about whenever you're doing your back bends, this area of the body, trying to open that up as much as possible by tilting the pelvis back, squeezing the glutes, using the glutes to extend. And one of my favorite things to do is to play around with isolating hip extension. And it's harder than you might think. So one example is like in a tabletop position. If you do something where you take your leg back, it's very easy to let the low back do the majority of the work there. But if you think about that ugly butt posture, you can see I can't get my leg as high, but you better believe my glute is working way, way harder than if I do this. Can you see the difference? That's like kind of ugly butt.